Today, April 28th, 2026, something broke inside the global energy system, and most people have not fully registered what it means yet. This morning, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social and said something that sitting heads of state almost never say out loud publicly. He said Iran has just informed the United States that it is, his exact words, posted for the world to read, in a state of collapse. Not weakened, not struggling, not under pressure, collapse. From the President of the United States on a Tuesday morning in April. And on that exact same morning, the United Arab Emirates announced it was leaving OPEC, the world's most powerful oil cartel. Effective May 1st, the third largest producer in the cartel, a country that joined OPEC's predecessor before the UAE even existed as a sovereign state, walked out. Two events on the same morning, April 28th, and they are connected in ways that go much deeper than anything you will see in today's headlines. Here's what makes this moment genuinely different from every other major energy crisis we have witnessed over the past 20 years. This crisis is not about supply running out. It is about a system cracking. The system that has managed and priced global oil for 60 years. Oil crossed $100 a barrel again today. Brent is sitting above $110. WTI just touched $102. These are not spikes from a refinery fire. Citi, one of the largest financial institutions on earth, has put a number on the table that would have sounded impossible 6 months ago. They say Brent crude could reach $150 a barrel by the third quarter of this year. Let that land. $150. Oil started 2026 at $60. In 9 weeks, one conflict has pushed oil prices up more than 80%. That is not a market fluctuation. That is a break. The World Bank released its commodity markets outlook this morning, using language extraordinary for an institution known for measured, cautious communication. They said global energy prices are expected to surge 24% in 2026, the largest single-year increase since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. That forecast assumes the worst disruptions begin to ease by May. Right now, there's no clear evidence that will happen on schedule. What I want to do in this video is walk you through what is actually happening beneath the surface of these numbers and why it matters far beyond your gas bill. Why the UAE walking out of OPEC this morning is not just an oil politics story, and why Iran's internal situation is the variable that nobody in Washington can fully price, because this is not a temporary disruption. This is a realignment of how global energy gets produced, controlled, and priced going forward. Before we continue, if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, drop a comment below. Does a deal get done? Does OPEC survive this? And hit like. It genuinely helps this reach more people. To understand exactly where we are today, you have to go back to February 28th, 2026, because that is where the entire chain of consequences begins. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran that day. Stated targets were Iran's nuclear infrastructure and its ballistic missile program. Within 72 hours, Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide passage through which 20% of the world's seaborne crude and LNG normally moves. Not symbolically closed, functionally closed. Vessel traffic collapsed from 129 transits per day, the UN Trade and Development pre-war average, to a fraction of that. The IEA called what followed the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global energy market. The greatest energy security challenge in history. Their words. Brent had been at $69 a barrel at the start of the year. It was at $73 when strikes began. By early March, it hit a session high near $120 as markets began pricing in a prolonged conflict with no clear exit. A fragile ceasefire between the US and Iran was announced on April 8th. Prices pulled back briefly, then climbed again as the ceasefire changed nothing on the ground. The strait stayed closed. The US naval blockade on Iranian ports remained in place. Peace talks kept producing frameworks that collapsed before anyone signed anything. Goldman Sachs pushed its estimate for when Persian Gulf exports normalize all the way to the end of June. Base case, while WTI at $83 by year-end, Brent at $90. Citi's scenario goes further, $130 average through Q3. The World Bank's worst case, if regional facilities take more damage, puts Brent averaging $115 for the full year. The IMF cut its 2026 global growth forecast to 3.1%. It raised its global inflation estimate to 4.4%. It warned that if this persists into 2027, growth could fall to 2%. Goldman Sachs raised its U.S. recession probability to 30% in March, directly tied to what this energy shock is doing to inflation and household spending across the country. The numbers are important, but the architecture behind those numbers is what matters more than any single price point on any given Tuesday. That architecture is now breaking in 3 places simultaneously, and each break is feeding the others in ways that make resolution harder, not easier, by the day. Iran is being strangled by its own strategic weapon. The UAE just walked out of the cartel designed to unify producers. And peace talks keep collapsing before they produce anything real. Here is the part that almost nobody is discussing publicly yet, and it matters enormously for everything that comes next in this story. When Iran shut the strait and prices began to climb, most market analysis rested on one assumption that turned out to be fundamentally wrong. The assumption was that Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, would step in and compensate. They would pump more and the market would rebalance around the disruption. That assumption failed, and understanding why it failed tells you everything about how fragile this market's foundation actually is when it gets genuinely tested. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline runs to Fujairah on the east coast, outside the strait, directly into the Gulf of Oman, capacity near 1.8 million barrels per day. That pipeline is the most important piece of alternative export infrastructure in the entire Gulf region. It was specifically built to bypass exactly this kind of Hormuz closure scenario. But even that pipeline cannot replace what Hormuz handles. 20 million barrels per day flow through the strait in peacetime. All alternative Gulf routes combined can move maybe a third of that at maximum. In practice, the UAE can produce and export through Fujairah, but war risk premiums and insurance dislocations hit every Gulf producer regardless of which route their tankers take. OPEC's quota system was built for a stable world where collective supply adjustments produce predictable price responses. The Iran war broke that model at its foundation. When the cartel's third largest producer cannot move most of its oil because the main waterway is closed, production quotas become almost meaningless to real-world market conditions. So when the UAE announced this morning it is leaving OPEC effective May 1st, this was not a frustrated exit over a quota disagreement between long-standing allies. It was a cold calculation. In the current environment, OPEC membership generates constraints without delivering any benefit that Abu Dhabi cannot achieve independently. If you cannot sell your oil through Hormuz, regardless of your quota, why accept production limits on top of that? There is no satisfying answer to that question inside the cartel right now. The UAE's energy minister explained the timing directly to CNN this morning. With the strait closed, Abu Dhabi cannot flood the market even if it wanted to. The exit's immediate impact is minimal. The exit costs Abu Dhabi nothing today, but it unlocks maximum production and pricing freedom the moment Hormuz reopens and the region begins the long process of normalization. In my view, that sequencing is not accidental. The UAE is positioning itself to be first out of the gate when this ends, unconstrained while others are still bound by OPEC agreements. What I want you to notice is that the UAE's exit is not just about the UAE. It is a signal to every other member that cartel discipline dissolves the moment survival instincts take over. Iraq, which has historically exceeded its OPEC quotas more than almost any other member, is watching this closely. Kazakhstan, Nigeria, and others are watching too. The message from Abu Dhabi will echo through every OPEC capital for months. When the math stops working, you leave. And for more producers, every week the math is stopping working. What this means for Saudi Arabia, absorbing the most direct damage from the UAE's exit, is something we need to examine carefully. Riyadh's position right now is far more complicated than it appears, and then we follow the money through to Washington and Tehran. The fracture inside OPEC and the stalemate at the peace table are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from two different angles. Saudi Arabia is now alone at the top of OPEC, and the numbers behind that position are far worse than Riyadh will ever admit publicly. Before today, Saudi Arabia was already carrying the heaviest load inside the cartel, largest producer, de facto price manager. The country expected to cut when prices fell and hold the line when others cheated on quotas. That role always came with costs, but it also came with leverage, because when you control the most spare capacity in the world, everyone at the table needs something from you. That leverage is now being tested under conditions that were never part of the original design. And the math underneath Saudi Arabia's fiscal position deserves close attention. Here is the number that explains everything about where Riyadh actually stands right now, not where it appears to stand from the outside. The IMF calculates Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even oil price at $86.60 per barrel for central government spending alone. That is the official floor from the IMF's own figures. Bloomberg Economics puts the consolidated figure, once you include the public investment fund's capital requirements, at $108 to $111 per barrel. That is the real number that matters. Brent is trading above $110 today. On paper, Saudi Arabia looks fine. In reality, there is a problem that the price alone cannot solve, and it is structural. Saudi Arabia's primary Hormuz bypass is the east-west pipeline, running from Abqaiq in the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Total throughput capacity near 7 million barrels per day. But roughly 2 million of those barrels must go to domestic refineries along the route. Net export capacity through Yanbu, approximately 5 million barrels per day at maximum. Saudi Arabia's OPEC quota before the war was around 10 million barrels per day. The pipeline can handle roughly half of that at maximum. The arithmetic is unforgiving. The price is high, but the volume is missing. And high price on half your normal volume does not cover what full volume at a moderate price used to generate reliably. Goldman Sachs has estimated the war-adjusted 2026 Saudi deficit at 6.6% of GDP, roughly double the official 3.3% forecast that Riyadh published before the conflict began. That implies a gap of $80 to $90 billion rather than the budgeted $44 billion, a $36 to $46 billion annual shortfall that Saudi Arabia's borrowing plan was simply not designed to absorb. Iranian strikes on Saudi infrastructure have compounded the pressure. Bloomberg reported in early April that attacks on energy facilities cut Saudi production capacity by an additional 600,000 barrels per day. Saudi Arabia entered this war with $438 billion in foreign exchange reserves. That sounds formidable. In 2015, Riyadh burned through $109 billion in under 12 months. And that was a crisis where Hormuz stayed open. In the first month of this war alone, Saudi crude revenue losses exceeded $10 billion. That covers crude oil only, not LPG shutdowns, not insurance surges, not the damage to investor confidence in the kingdom. Vision 2030 was built on one core assumption. Oil revenues fund the transformation while new industries grow. That assumption is under pressure every day this crisis runs without a resolution. Every additional month Hormuz stays effectively closed, Riyadh faces the same impossible choice: slow the mega project pipeline or accelerate debt issuance on international markets while the war is still running. In January 2026, Saudi Arabia raised $12 billion in bonds in one placement and attracted $37 billion in orders. Markets still view Saudi debt as safe, but going to markets that urgently, mid-war, tells you something. The kingdom needed $12 billion urgently enough to go to international markets in the middle of a regional war. Saudi Arabia's full year 2026 borrowing plan totals $57.86 billion, a number set before any of this began. Now add the UAE's exit on top of all of that. And here is why this morning's announcement is more painful for Riyadh than any official response will suggest. Rystad Energy's head of geopolitical analysis wrote in a note published today, Saudi Arabia is now left doing more of the heavy lifting on price stability, and the market loses one of the few shock absorbers it had left. The UAE was one of the only OPEC members besides Saudi Arabia with genuine spare production capacity, the ability to add extra barrels to the market quickly when conditions required a response. With the UAE outside the cartel starting Friday, that tool is gone from the collective toolbox. Saudi Arabia absorbs the volatility with fewer partners sharing the burden. There is a longer dimension to this exit beyond quota mechanics. Bloomberg this morning called it the culmination of years of tension between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh over far more than oil production levels. They backed opposing forces in Yemen. They have competed directly for the same foreign direct investment. They have clashed over economic policy inside the Gulf Cooperation Council. The war accelerated a split that was already developing. Abu Dhabi simply found the perfect timing, a moment when the exit's market impact is minimal because no one can export freely through Hormuz anyway. In my view, what matters most here is not the loss of one member in isolation. It is the signal about what happens to collective cartel discipline when genuine survival pressure arrives. OPEC has survived price wars, member collapses, and internal quota cheating for decades. It survived because its largest members ultimately chose cartel loyalty over individual optimization when it counted. The UAE just demonstrated that under sufficient pressure, individual optimization wins. That lesson will echo through every OPEC capital, Baghdad, Luanda, Caracas, for years. Now connect this directly to the negotiating table. Because Saudi Arabia's fiscal pressure and the collapse of the peace talks are not separate problems, they are feeding each other. The Islamabad talks on April 11th lasted 21 hours. The highest level face-to-face engagement between Washington and Tehran since the 1979 revolution. J.D. Vance led the U.S. side. Iran's Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf led theirs. At the end of 21 hours, Vance boarded Air Force Two and left without a deal. Washington required Iran to commit to never developing nuclear weapons. Tehran refused to make that commitment on the spot. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi said afterward, the sides came within inches on most issues, but described encountering maximalist demands and shifting goalposts specifically on the nuclear question. Trump summarized it on Fox News. The meeting was good on nearly everything, except they want to have nuclear weapons. That single sentence captures the gap that 21 hours of negotiations could not close. After Islamabad collapsed, Trump imposed the naval blockade on Iranian ports on April 13th. That blockade is fully in effect today. Iran's tankers are turned back. Its storage tanks are filling toward capacity limits. Iran submitted a revised proposal through Pakistan over the weekend. The offer? Reopen Hormuz now, address nuclear separately in later talks. Trump signaled Monday he would not accept that sequencing. As of today, Pakistan's mediators say a further revised Iranian proposal is expected within days, but the core gap has not changed since April 12th. It has simply been repackaged and resubmitted. Washington will not lift the blockade without nuclear guarantees. Tehran cannot deliver while its internal fractures hold. Every day this stalemate continues, every Gulf producer absorbs more damage with no visible exit. Saudi Arabia's silence on the UAE exit today is itself a message. Riyadh needs this war to end and Hormuz open, so that high prices finally translate into actual revenue rather than theoretical figures on a screen. Riyadh cannot say that publicly. It cannot call for a deal Washington rejected. But no condemnation of Abu Dhabi, no call for OPEC unity this morning. That absence tells you Riyadh is actively recalculating everything. And the direction of that recalculation will matter more for what comes next in this crisis than almost anything happening at the negotiating table right now. Iran's oil wells are facing forced shutdown within 2 to 3 weeks. Kepler puts the storage buffer at 12 to 22 days, a physical, geological deadline that changes how much time is left to make a deal. Here is what is actually happening inside Iran's oil infrastructure right now, because the numbers are more specific than most coverage is letting on. Before the U.S. naval blockade took effect on April 13th, Iran was exporting roughly 1.85 million barrels of oil per day, almost entirely to China. Since the blockade began, those exports have collapsed to approximately 567,000 barrels per day. According to Kepler, the commodity intelligence firm that tracks tanker loadings, that is a 70% drop in export volume in under 3 weeks. The oil is still being produced, it has nowhere to go, and Iran's storage tanks are filling fast. Kepler puts Iran's total onshore storage at roughly 86 million barrels, but operational limits mean much of it is not practically usable. Effective working capacity is filling fast, with 12 to 22 days of buffer left. When storage is full, Iran faces a choice that has no good options. Either shut down the wells, or keep pumping into tanks that are already at capacity, which causes physical damage to the infrastructure. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent posted on X this week. In a matter of days, Karg Island storage will be full, and the fragile Iranian oil wells will be shut in. Goldman Sachs estimated Iran had already curtailed up to 2.5 million barrels per day by late April. The storage crisis now threatens an additional 1.5 million BPD of forced cuts by mid-May. Here is the part that matters most about this deadline. Shutting down oil wells in mature fields is not like turning off a tap. It is a geological event with consequences that extend years beyond the crisis itself. When wells in mature carbonate reservoirs are shut in under these conditions, reservoir damage accumulates. Some production capacity, once lost this way, cannot be fully recovered even after the blockade ends. This means every additional day the blockade holds, Iran loses not just today's revenue, it permanently reduces the oil production capacity it would need to rebuild its economy after any future deal. Iranian energy official Esmail Saghab Esfahani warned publicly, if Iran's infrastructure is damaged by the blockade, 4 times that damage would hit the oil infrastructure of U.S. allies in the region. That threat is being priced into energy markets. It is part of why Citi's $150 scenario is not being dismissed. If acted on, the supply shock gets dramatically worse than any current forecast assumes. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely complicated. Because the storage deadline does not mean Iran is about to surrender. The picture is more nuanced than Washington's messaging suggests. The Eurasia Group's Gregory Brew, cited by Axios today, challenges the most aggressive timelines. Iran has more flexibility than 2-week estimates suggest. The blockade has not been perfectly airtight. Iranian exports have not hit zero. But Kepler said it has not observed a tanker successfully evading the blockade around Hormuz. Iran is moving some oil by rail to China. Enforcement is tighter than early estimates. Iran opened its own shipping channel north of Larak Island, separate from the main Hormuz lane. One ship reportedly paid $2 million to use it. The IRGC has revenue streams well beyond official oil exports. Iran is under severe pressure. The storage crisis is real. The revenue collapse is real. But the timeline to capitulation remains uncertain. And Tehran's negotiators know that uncertainty is their last card. Now zoom out and look at who else is watching this deadline clock. Because the positioning of China and Russia over the past 2 weeks reveals something important about where this crisis is actually heading. China's situation is paradoxical in ways most coverage misses. Beijing has condemned the blockade loudly, calling it dangerous and irresponsible, risking further escalation across the region. And yet China has been the primary buyer of Iran's oil for years, importing more than 80% of Iran's shipped crude before the war. The blockade directly cuts China's energy supply from one of its largest sources. China depends on Hormuz for 45 to 50% of its total crude imports, per Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. With the strait effectively closed, Beijing is absorbing a supply shock it cannot ignore. China's crude oil and gas imports fell in March compared to a year earlier. The first tangible data confirmation that Hormuz disruptions are starting to materially affect Chinese energy flows. Beijing is simultaneously condemning the blockade, absorbing its consequences, and buying replacement crude from Russia, which benefits directly from every barrel of Iranian oil that cannot reach China. In Q1 2026, 90% of Russia's total crude exports went to China and India, per CNBC shipping data. Russia is filling the gap Iran's blocked exports created at elevated war premium prices. This is the dynamic that almost nobody is discussing openly. Russia publicly condemns the U.S. campaign, calls for Iran's sovereignty, vetoed the UN Security Council Hormuz resolution alongside China on April 7th. And simultaneously, Russia is the single largest financial beneficiary of every day the strait stays closed. Moscow's fossil fuel revenues are surging precisely because Iran's oil cannot reach the market. Putin met Arakchi in St. Petersburg this past weekend. He said he received a message from Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei. The language was warm, the economics underneath that warmth point in a very different direction. In my view, Russia's position here is the most calculated of any major power. Moscow offers Iran solidarity while capturing the market share Iran's absence creates. Support that costs Russia nothing. China's position is more conflicted. Beijing needs Hormuz open for energy security, needs Iran as a long-term supplier, and must avoid confrontation with Washington, while U.S.-China trade tensions stay elevated. China played a key role convincing Iran to accept the April 7th ceasefire, per multiple sources. Beijing and Islamabad proposed a 5-point peace plan on March 31st. Not the moves of a power at ease with this running, but China has not exerted direct pressure on Iran sufficient to force the concessions Washington demands. Beijing threads a needle, pushing de-escalation without siding with Washington against its own oil supplier. What this creates is an environment where everyone wants the crisis to end, but nobody has leverage to force resolution on their preferred terms, and the deadline clock keeps ticking in Tehran's oil fields. The dual blockade, Iran blocking Gulf exports through Hormuz, the U.S. blocking Iranian exports through naval interdiction, has created economic pain for virtually every country in the world simultaneously. Vessel traffic through Hormuz now stands at roughly 5% of its pre-war level, per the House of Commons Library. 3,000 ships per month used the strait before February 28th. Roughly 150 are transiting now. IEA members, 32 countries including the US and most of Europe, have released 400 million barrels from strategic reserves to cushion the shock. That is buying time. It is not solving the underlying problem. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made the position of the international community plain this week. Let ships pass, no tolls, no discrimination, let trade resume, let the global economy breathe. That framing, let the global economy breathe, is telling. 9 weeks into this crisis, the language of international institutions is no longer describing an energy market disruption. It is describing an emergency. The emergency has a specific clock attached to it. Iran's storage deadline, Saudi Arabia's fiscal runway, the IEA's reserve buffer. All of these timelines converge toward the same window, the next 4 to 6 weeks. What happens inside that window determines the outcome. Whether Iran's proposal finds a structure Washington accepts, whether the storage deadline forces Tehran's hand, whether quiet pressure finally reshapes the terms. Nobody in Washington, Tehran, Beijing, or Riyadh knows how this ends, and that uncertainty itself, right now, today, is the most dangerous variable in the entire crisis. Here's what the situation actually looks like as of this morning, April 28th, stripped of the official language from all sides. Iran submitted a new proposal through Pakistan over the weekend. The offer was straightforward. Reopen Hormuz, end the war, lift the blockade, and address the nuclear question in a separate later negotiation.